child's breathing came in ragged gasps that tore through the desert silence like a dying coyote's last wail. Sarah Whitmore knelt in the dust outside her cabin, her weathered hands hovering inches above the boy's fevered forehead, while 6 families formed a desperate circle around them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their tear-streaked faces, each parent clutching their own dying loved one, waiting to see if the stories were true. "Please, miss," the boy's mother whispered, her voice cracking like old leather. "He ain't got much time left. The fever's been burning him up for 3 days straight." Sarah's fingers trembled. She could feel the familiar heat radiating from her palms, that terrible gift that had followed her across half the continent. One touch and the boy would live. One touch and 10 years of her life would drain away like water in the sand. She was 32 now, but her body carried the weight of 57 years. Her back ached constantly, her hair had gone silver, and lines carved deep valleys around her eyes. The child convulsed, his small body arching off the blanket. Blood frothed at the corners of his mouth. Behind his mother, a grizzled rancher held his unconscious daughter, her leg mangled from a horse accident and turning black with infection. An elderly woman cradled her grandson, shot through the lung by claim jumpers. Twin infants burned with the same fever that was killing the boy, their father's knuckles white as he gripped them against his chest. "We heard tell you can heal folks?" the rancher said, his voice rough with desperation. "We rode 2 days straight to get here. My little girl, she's all I got left in this world." Sarah closed her eyes. The heat in her hands grew stronger, demanding release. She'd sworn she wouldn't do this anymore. Each healing stole a decade from her, and at this rate, she'd be dead before 40. But the boy's rattling breath filled her ears, and she could smell the metallic tang of blood mixing with the dust. "The stories ain't all true," she said quietly, though her hands remained poised above the child. "There's a price for what I can do, a price you wouldn't understand." "Name it," the mother sobbed. "Anything. Gold, cattle, land, whatever you want." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at the circle of desperate faces. She'd seen this look before, in other towns, other times. The look of people who'd ride to the ends of the earth for just one more day with someone they loved. The same look she'd worn when she'd first discovered her cursed gift. The boy's breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, Sarah felt the weight of 6 families' hopes pressing down on her like stones. Her hands burned with power she'd never asked for. Power that would save this child, but steal 10 more years from her dwindling life. She could walk away, let nature take its course, preserve what little time she had left. Or she could touch the boy's forehead and watch another decade of her life evaporate like morning dew. But let's go back to how it all started, 48 hours ago, when the first desperate family appeared on her horizon and Sarah Whitmore realized that running from her gift had only led her straight back to the hardest choice of all. The dust cloud had appeared at noon 2 days prior, rising from the desert floor like a brown serpent. Sarah had watched it approach from her cabin's single window, her heart already sinking. She'd chosen this remote valley precisely because travelers rarely passed through. But someone had found her again. Someone always found her. She'd stepped onto her porch as the wagon rolled to a stop, already knowing what she'd see. The same desperate faces, the same dying loved one, the same impossible choice. This time it was the rancher and his daughter. The girl's mangled leg wrapped in blood-soaked bandages that couldn't hide the smell of infection creeping in. "You, Sarah Whitmore?" the man had asked, his hat in his hands. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Tom Brennan. This here's my daughter Lucy. She's dying, and folks in Yuma said you could help." Sarah had looked at the girl, unconscious and pale as winter snow, and felt the familiar heat building in her palms. Even then, she'd known more would come. Word always spread. One healing led to two, two led to four, and before long, every desperate soul within 100 miles would be beating a path to her door. Now here she knelt in the dust with 6 families surrounding her, all their hopes pinned on hands that could work miracles at a price too terrible to pay. The gift had come to Sarah on her 16th birthday, arriving with all the subtlety of a lightning strike. She'd been kneeling beside her father's deathbed in their small farmhouse outside Abilene, watching consumption eat away at the man who'd raised her alone after her mother died birthing her. Doc Henderson had already given his verdict. Maybe hours, certainly not days. "Sarah, girl." Her father had wheezed, his once strong hands now nothing but bone and yellowed skin. "I'm sorry I won't be here to see you married. Sorry you'll be alone." She'd pressed her palms against his fevered forehead, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Don't talk like that, Pa. You're gonna get better." The heat had started then, a warmth spreading from somewhere deep in her chest, down through her arms and into her hands. At first, she thought it was just grief, the way sorrow could make your whole body burn. But the warmth grew stronger, pulsing like a heartbeat, until her palms felt like brands against her father's skin. His eyes had snapped open, clear and bright for the first time in weeks. Color flooded back into his cheeks. His breathing deepened, steadied, became strong. She'd watched in amazement as years of sickness simply melted away, leaving him whole and healthy as the day before consumption took hold. Then she'd caught sight of herself in the mirror across the room. The girl who'd knelt beside the bed was gone. In her place sat a woman of 26, silver threading through hair that had been golden brown moments before, lines etched around eyes that had been smooth as river stones. Her body ached in places that had never hurt, and when she stood, her back protested like she'd been working fields for a decade. Her father had sat up in bed, staring at her with horror and wonder warring in his eyes. "Sarah? What happened to you? What did you do?" She'd run then, fled into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and the terrible knowledge that she'd somehow traded 10 years of her life for his. By morning, she was on a westbound stage, leaving behind everything she'd ever known. That had been 16 years ago. 16 years of running, of trying to ignore the heat that built in her hands whenever she saw suffering. She'd lasted 3 months before healing a child with cholera in a Kansas town, aging another decade in an instant. Then a gunshot victim in Colorado, a woman bleeding out in childbirth in New Mexico. Each time she'd sworn it would be the last, each time she'd fled to somewhere more remote, more isolated. The frontier had seemed perfect for disappearing. Out here, a woman could claim any age she wanted, and folks were too busy surviving to ask too many questions. She'd built her cabin in this hidden valley, lived off game and the vegetables she could coax from the desert soil. For 2 years, she'd managed to avoid using her gift, until Tom Brennan and his dying daughter had appeared like a judgment from God. She'd held out for 6 hours, listening to the girl's labored breathing from inside her cabin, while the father sat vigil beside the wagon. Finally, as the sun set behind the mountains, Sarah had walked outside and placed her hands on Lucy Brennan's infected leg. The healing had been instant and absolute. The infection vanished, the bone straightened, the flesh knitted together without even a scar. But Sarah had felt those familiar 10 years drain away like water through a sieve. When she looked at her reflection in the water barrel the next morning, she saw a woman of 57 staring back. Tom Brennan had tried to pay her with gold, with cattle, with promises of protection. She'd refused it all, just asked him to keep quiet about what he'd seen. But she'd known even as the words left her mouth that it was hopeless. A miracle like healing his daughter couldn't stay secret long. The second family had arrived the next afternoon. The old woman with her shot grandson riding hard from a settlement 30 miles south. Word was already spreading through the desert like wildfire. There was a woman in the hidden valley who could heal anything, cure anyone, bring the dying back from death's door. By evening, 4 more wagons had appeared on the horizon. Now Sarah knelt in the dust with 6 dying souls before her, each healing representing another decade stolen from her dwindling life. At this rate, she'd be dead before Christmas. But looking down at the boy's still face, at his mother's tears falling like rain on parched earth, she knew she couldn't walk away. The heat in her hands pulsed stronger, demanding release. She'd discovered long ago that fighting her gift only made it worse, like trying to dam a river with her bare hands. The power would build and build until it felt like her bones might crack from the pressure. "Tell me about your boy," she said to the mother, still not touching the child's skin. "What's his name?" "Billy," the woman whispered. "Billy Morrison. He's 7 years old, loves horses and fishing, and..." Her voice broke. "He wants to be a cowboy when he grows up." Sarah closed her eyes. 7 years old. The same age she'd been when her mother died, when she'd learned that sometimes the people you loved most just slipped away, no matter how hard you held on. This boy had his whole life ahead of him. Decades of sunrises and laughter and love. What right did she have to let him die to preserve her own remaining years? The weeks following Lucy Brennan's healing had taught Sarah that miracles, once witnessed, spread faster than prairie fire. Word carried from settlement to settlement, growing in the telling until the stories bore little resemblance to truth. Some claimed she could raise the dead, others that she required payment in souls. A traveling preacher insisted she was an angel sent by God, while a whiskey drummer swore she was in league with the devil himself. Sarah had tried moving deeper into the desert, but the desperate found her anyway. They came singly at first, then in pairs, finally in wagon trains of the dying and diseased. Each time she used her gift, she felt another decade slip away like sand through an hourglass. Her joints ached constantly now. Her hair had gone completely silver, and her hands bore the liver spots of advanced age despite her true years numbering only 32. The hardest part wasn't the physical aging. It was the weight of choosing who lived and who died. She'd established rules to try to preserve what little life she had left. Children first, always children. Adults only if they had young ones depending on them. Never more than one healing per family, no matter how many they brought. But rules crumbled like adobe in a flash flood when faced with a mother's tears or a father's desperate pleas. There had been the Mitchell family, traveling to California with twin boys struck down by dysentery. Sarah had healed one child, watching 10 years drain from her body, then had to watch the other die while his brother recovered. The surviving twin had asked why God saved him but not his brother, and Sarah had no answer that didn't taste like ash in her mouth. The Kellys had brought their patriarch, a man who'd built 3 towns and raised 7 children, now dying from a rattlesnake bite. Sarah had saved him, aging another decade, only to learn later that he'd used his renewed health to murder 2 claim jumpers and steal their gold. Her gift didn't discriminate between the worthy and the wicked. Worst of all had been Elena Vasquez, 17 and dying in childbirth, with her first baby. Sarah had placed her hands on the girl's swollen belly feeling 2 heartbeats fluttering like trapped birds. She'd poured 20 years of her life into that healing, saving both mother and child, then collapsed from the sudden aging. When she'd awakened, her body carried the weight of 72 years, though her mind remained sharp as a blade. That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, she'd barely been able to walk without her makeshift cane, carved from desert ironwood and worn smooth by her increasingly unsteady grip. Every breath was an effort, every movement a negotiation with joints that felt like rusted hinges. She'd sworn off healing after Elena, barricaded herself in the cabin, and refused to see the visitors who still came. But they kept coming anyway, camping outside her door, their loved ones dying in wagons while they begged and pleaded and wept. The sounds haunted her dreams. Children crying for their mothers, men calling out in fever delirium, women keening over bodies growing cold in the desert night. Sheriff Wade Patterson had arrived 4 days ago, drawn by reports of the strange woman who could work miracles. He was a hard man with suspicious eyes and a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions. Sarah had watched him from her window as he examined the campsite full of desperate families, noting the fresh graves scattered across the valley where her gift had come too late. "Folks say you're some kind of healer," he'd called through her door. "Mighty convenient, all these sick people finding their way to your little valley. Mighty profitable too, I'd wager." Sarah had kept silent, but she'd seen the way his hand rested on his gun butt. In his mind, she was running some kind of elaborate confidence game, preying on the desperate for money. He couldn't conceive of the real truth, that she was slowly killing herself to keep strangers alive. Now, kneeling in the dust with Billy Morrison still formed before her, Sarah felt the weight of all those choices pressing down like a mountain. Every life she'd saved had cost her dearly, but every life she'd failed to save haunted her even more. The heat in her palms pulsed with familiar insistence, demanding she choose between her remaining years and this boy's entire future. Behind Billy's mother, the other families waited with their own dying loved ones. Tom Brennan's daughter Lucy sat in the wagon, fully healed, but watching with wide eyes as her father held another child on death's doorstep. The old woman clutched her grandson tighter, his breath barely misting in the cooling air. The twins' father swayed on his feet, exhaustion and grief etched deep in his weathered face. "Please," Billy's mother whispered again. "I know you're tired. I can see what this costs you. But he's just a baby. He ain't had a chance to live yet." Sarah looked at her own hands, gnarled now with premature age, spotted and lined like ancient parchment. If she healed Billy, she'd have maybe 5 or 6 years left, assuming she never used her gift again. If she healed them all, she'd be dead before the sun set. But if she walked away, 6 innocent souls would die while she watched, and she'd spend whatever years remained knowing she could have prevented it. The desert wind picked up, scattering dust across the silent gathering. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and Sarah thought she heard the echo of her own mortality in that lonely sound. Sheriff Patterson's boots had hit the ground just as the 6th wagon rolled into Sarah's valley that morning, his arrival timing itself like a bad omen. He dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who'd seen too much frontier justice, his badge catching the early sunlight as he surveyed the desperate camp that had grown around Sarah's cabin. "This ends today," he'd announced to the gathered families, his voice carrying the authority of law in a lawless land. "I've been tracking reports of a woman running healing scams from here to Santa Fe, taking advantage of grieving folks, promising miracles for gold." Tom Brennan had stepped forward, his healed daughter Lucy beside him as living proof. "Ain't no scam, Sheriff. This woman saved my girl's life. Leg was rotting clean off, and now look at her. Patterson had examined Lucy with skeptical eyes, noting her perfect health, the complete absence of scars where infection should have left its mark. Mighty convenient recovery. How much did this miracle cost you? She wouldn't take nothing, not a single coin. That had given the sheriff pause, but Sarah could see his mind working, trying to fit the pieces into a pattern that made sense to his law and order worldview. A woman who healed for free was almost more suspicious than one who charged. There had to be an angle, some profit hidden in the shadows. Sarah had watched from her window as more families arrived throughout the morning. The widow Hartley with her fever-struck twins, the infant boys burning up in their mother's arms. Old Pete Kowalski carrying his grandson who'd taken a bullet, meant for someone else. The boy's chest rising and falling in painful gasps. Each arrival had drawn Patterson's attention, his hand never straying far from his gun. "You planning on explaining yourself, woman?" He'd called to her cabin around noon. "Or am I gonna have to drag you out here?" She'd remained silent, knowing that any explanation would sound like madness. How could she tell him that she aged 10 years with every healing? That her gift was both miracle and curse, salvation and slow suicide? He'd either think her insane or assume she was running an elaborate con. But the dying couldn't wait for legal proceedings. Billy Morrison's fever had spiked just after midday, his small body convulsing as his parents held him in their wagon. His mother's wails had cut through the desert air like a blade, drawing every eye in the camp. Sarah had felt the familiar heat building in her hands, that terrible power demanding release, as it always did when faced with innocent suffering. She'd stepped outside then, unable to stay hidden while a child died within her reach. The moment her weathered face appeared in the doorway, every desperate parent had surged forward, each clutching their own dying loved one. The camp had erupted into chaos, 6 families pleading simultaneously for her attention, for her touch, for the miracle they'd traveled so far to find. "Stay back!" Patterson had shouted, drawing his gun as the crowd pressed closer to Sarah's porch. "All of you, stay back! This woman is under investigation for fraud." But desperation made people brave. Tom Brennan had pushed past the sheriff's outstretched arm, Lucy still at his side. "This ain't fraud, Sheriff. I seen what she can do. My daughter's alive because of her. And how many others have died while she played games?" Patterson had shot back. "Look around, man. Count the fresh graves. This whole valley's turning into a boneyard." Sarah had descended from her porch slowly, her makeshift cane supporting her aged frame. The families had parted before her like water, their eyes fixed on her spotted hands with a mixture of hope and fear. She could feel the power building stronger now, responding to the proximity of so much pain and dying. "Sheriff," she'd said quietly, her voice carrying the rasp of premature age. "These folks ain't here because of any scam. They're here because their loved ones are dying and they got nowhere else to turn." Patterson had studied her face, noting the deep lines, the silver hair, the way she moved like a woman 3 times her actual age. "You don't look like no young confidence artist, but appearances can deceive." "They surely can," Sarah had agreed, then knelt beside Billy Morrison as his mother laid him on a blanket in the dust. That had been an hour ago. Now, with the boys' breathing stopped and 6 families forming their desperate circle, Sarah felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. Every healing that had aged her, every life she'd saved at the cost of her own years, every time she'd run from her gift only to have it find her again. Sheriff Patterson stood at the edge of the circle, his gun still drawn but lowered, confusion warring with duty in his weathered face. He'd come expecting to arrest a fraud and found something that defied his understanding of how the world worked. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, and Sarah could taste dust and desperation in the air. Around her, the dying waited. Billy Morrison, still and silent. Lucy Brennan's father clutching another family's hopes, the twins burning with fever, the shot boy bleeding his life away. 6 souls balanced on the knife's edge between life and death, and only her cursed hands could tip the scale. The heat in her palms had grown almost unbearable. 60 years of accumulated power demanding release. One touch would save Billy Morrison and cost her another decade. 6 touches would save them all and leave her dead in the dust beside them. Sarah's hands trembled as she placed them on Billy Morrison's still chest, feeling the terrible heat surge through her palms like lightning seeking ground. The moment her skin touched his, 10 years of her life poured into the boy like water into parched earth. She felt her spine curve deeper, her joints seize with arthritis that hadn't existed moments before, her vision blur as cataracts clouded eyes that had been clear. Billy's chest rose with a shuddering breath. Color flooded back into his pale cheeks. His fever broke instantly, sweat beading on skin that had been burning with disease. He opened his eyes and looked up at his mother with the bright curiosity of a healthy 7-year-old boy. "Mama," he whispered, "I'm thirsty." His mother sobbed, clutching him to her chest, while the other families pressed closer, their own desperation reaching fever pitch. Sarah struggled to her feet, her aged body protesting every movement. She was 82 now, though only minutes had passed. Her heart hammered irregularly against ribs that felt brittle as bird bones. "My grandson next." Old Pete Kowalski pushed forward, the bullet-torn boy limp in his arms. "Please, he's all the family I got left." "The twins." The widow Hartley thrust her burning infants toward Sarah. "They're babies. They ain't done nothing wrong." Sheriff Patterson stepped between Sarah and the desperate families, his gun raised but his face uncertain. Up close, he could see what each healing cost her. The woman who'd emerged from the cabin an hour ago had looked like a hard-used 50. Now she moved like someone's great-grandmother, bent and frail and running out of time. "What in hell are you?" he breathed, staring at her transformed face. "Dying," Sarah said simply. She looked at the 5 remaining families, their loved ones failing while precious seconds ticked away. "Just like them if I don't act." The power in her hands pulsed stronger now, as if sensing the proximity of so much death. She'd discovered years ago that her gift fed on itself, grew stronger the more she used it. Each healing made the next one more demanding, more insistent. Right now, the heat threatened to consume her from within if she didn't release it. Tom Brennan stepped forward, Lucy beside him. "You don't have to do this. You saved my girl, gave us our miracle. That's enough." "Is it?" Sarah looked at him with eyes clouded by premature age. "Is it enough when that baby over there stops breathing in the next 5 minutes? When those twins burn up while their mama watches? When that boy bleeds out because I decided my time was worth more than his?" She walked toward Pete Kowalski, her cane tapping against the hardpan. The old man's grandson couldn't be more than 12, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandages, and she could smell death gathering around him like vultures. "You'll die if you heal us all," the widow Hartley said, understanding dawning in her tear-streaked face. "That's what this costs you, ain't it? Your own life." Sarah nodded, placing her hands on the shot boy's chest. 10 years each time. I got maybe 20 left, 30 if I'm lucky. But how do I choose? How do I decide that this boy matters less than those twins? Or that your babies don't deserve the same chance I gave Billy? The second healing hit her like a physical blow. Another decade drained away, aging her to 92 in an instant. Her hair went completely white, her skin became papery and spotted with age. But the boy's eyes fluttered open, his breathing steadied, and the bullet wound sealed itself without leaving so much as a scar. Sheriff Patterson holstered his gun, understanding finally breaking over him like dawn. You're killing yourself to save them. Dying anyway, Sarah gasped, swaying on her feet. The twins' fever called to her, 2 small lives burning out while she stood there. Question is whether it means something. She stumbled toward the widow Hartley, her ancient hands reaching for the first baby. The woman pulled back instinctively, then stopped, tears streaming down her face. I can't ask you to die for them, she whispered. You ain't asking, Sarah said, touching the infant's forehead. I'm choosing. The third healing nearly dropped her. She was 102 now, held upright only by will and the desert ironwood cane. Her heart skipped beats, her lungs wheezed with fluid, her vision narrowed to tunnels. But the first twin's fever broke, his tiny fist grasping at his mother's finger with renewed strength. One more baby, one more healing, one more choice between her dwindling life and someone else's future. The remaining families watched in stunned silence as Sarah reached for the second twin. Even Sheriff Patterson had removed his hat, recognizing he was witnessing something far beyond his jurisdiction. This wasn't fraud or confidence games. This was sacrifice distilled to its purest form. Don't, Tom Brennan said quietly. You've done enough. More than enough. Sarah looked at him with eyes that had seen a century of hardship compressed into an afternoon. Would you have said that if it was Lucy burning up in her mama's arms? She touched the second twin's skin and felt the last decade of her life pour out like blood from a severed artery. The baby's fever broke, his breathing cleared, but Sarah collapsed into the dust, her body finally succumbing to the accumulated weight of 112 years. The desert wind picked up, scattering dust across the silent circle. Billy Morrison clung to his mother, healthy and whole. The twins nursed at their mother's breast, their fevers gone. Pete Kowalski's grandson sat up, asking for water. 3 families had gotten their miracles, but 3 others still knelt in the dust with their dying loved ones. And Sarah Whitmore lay motionless beside her cane, having given everything she had to save half of them. Sheriff Patterson knelt beside her, checking for a pulse he already knew he wouldn't find. She's gone, he said quietly. Then Sarah's eyes opened one last time. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly in the desert stillness. Touch ain't the only way to heal. Sometimes the healing comes from knowing someone cared enough to try. She pressed something into Patterson's palm, something warm that pulsed like a heartbeat. The sheriff felt heat flow up his arm, and suddenly he understood what she was asking him to do. The gift was his now, along with the terrible choice that came with it. He looked at the 3 remaining families, their loved ones still dying, still needing a miracle. His hands began to warm. Sheriff Wade Patterson never spoke of what happened in that hidden valley, though folks noticed he aged considerably in the months that followed. Sometimes desperate families would find him, drawn by stories that seemed too strange to believe. Each time, he'd make the same impossible choice Sarah Whitmore had made, trading years of his life for someone else's tomorrow. The graves in Sarah's valley became a shrine of sorts, marked by desert flowers that bloomed year-round despite the harsh climate. Travelers would stop to pay their respects to the woman who discovered that true healing wasn't about the power to save lives, but the courage to sacrifice everything for strangers who had nowhere else to turn. Billy Morrison grew up to become a doctor, dedicating his life to healing others without magic, only skill and compassion. The twins became teachers, spreading knowledge instead of miracles. Pete Kowalski's grandson became a sheriff himself, carrying on Patterson's work in ways both seen and unseen. And in the desert wind that whispered through the valley, folks sometimes swore they could hear Sarah's voice, reminding them that the greatest gift anyone could give wasn't healing hands or magical powers, but simply the willingness to choose love over self-preservation, hope over fear, and sacrifice over safety. Her touch had healed wounds, but her choice had healed something deeper. The broken places in human hearts that forgot how much one life could matter, how much difference one person willing to give everything could make in a world that often seemed too hard and cruel to bear.